can still remember the way the glass slipped from my hand that night, the sound of it shattering across the tile floor, louder than any argument we'd ever had. Mark had walked in late, the scent of expensive perfume clinging to his shirt. And behind him was the faint trace of laughter still caught in his throat. Laughter that wasn't mine. It was a small thing, really, the way he avoided my eyes as he set his phone face down on the counter, but it was enough. In that moment, I felt something inside me tilt, like the ground beneath our marriage had quietly cracked open. Before I continue, let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more true family stories of betrayal justice and the strength it takes to reclaim your dignity. My name is Elena Brooks, and for most of my life, I believed I had built something solid, something lasting. I grew up in Ohio, raised in a house where hard work and loyalty were treated as sacred values, the kind of lessons you carry into every choice you make. I became a high school counselor because I believed in guiding young people, showing them that steadiness and care could open doors when the world felt unstable. By the time I married Mark, I thought I had found a man who mirrored those same principles, a man who valued family above all else. Mark wasn't flashy, but he was dependable, or at least that's how it seemed. He worked in regional sales, always sharp in his suits, the kind of man who remembered neighbors' birthdays and shoveled snow off their driveways without being asked. Together, we raised our daughter Lily in a home that from the outside looked like the picture of suburban peace. I cooked Sunday dinners, he handled the grill, and Lily grew up believing her parents were a team. Even my father-in-law, Walter, would smile at us across the table and call us the steady ones. Tessa Grant was part of that picture too. She had been my friend since college, the one who always had the best stories, the loudest laugh, the knack for turning any gathering into a celebration. Our daughters were close in age, our lives often intertwined through school functions, birthdays, and late-night glasses of wine, when we needed to vent about work or husbands. I never once thought of her as a threat. She was family by extension, the kind of person you trusted without a second thought. For years, life moved in a rhythm that felt safe. Mark climbed steadily in his company, and I took pride in the trust parents placed in me at the school. Lily thrived both academically and socially, and our home became the kind of place kids wanted to spend time after practice. We weren't rich, not compared to some of the families we knew, but we were comfortable. We were, I believed, happy. Or maybe I was simply too busy holding everything together to notice the shadows creeping in at the edges. It wasn't one moment that shattered the illusion, but a collection of them. The way Mark's phone seemed to live in his hand, the sudden late meetings that never used to exist, the small arguments that ended with him sighing as if I were a burden rather than a partner. And then there was Tessa, always quick with a text to Mark about planning this or coordinating that, always laughing just a little too brightly when he entered the room. At the time, I told myself it was harmless. Friends share responsibilities. Friends lean on each other. Still late at night, I would lie awake listening to the quiet hum of our house and feel unease settling into my bones. Looking back now, I wonder how long I carried those doubts in silence, telling myself I was imagining things, clinging to the belief that marriage and friendship were unshakable. But deep down, I already knew that the cracks in our foundation weren't going away. They were spreading, and soon enough, one would split wide open, leaving me no choice but to see the truth I had been avoiding all along. It was a Thursday evening when I first allowed myself to admit that something was off. Mark had always been predictable about his routine. He came home around 6, sometimes 6:30, if traffic was heavy, and he would drop his briefcase by the door before loosening his tie and asking what was for dinner. That night, the clock pushed past 7:30 before his car pulled into the driveway. I was standing at the kitchen window when I saw his headlights sweep across the lawn. Instead of the tired slump of a man who had worked too long, he walked in carrying the faint trace of cologne that didn't belong to him, the kind that lingered a little too sweetly in the air. He mumbled a half-hearted apology about a late meeting avoiding my eyes as he passed by. I noticed the quick way he set his phone face down on the counter, something he had never bothered to do before. It was small, almost forgettable, yet it lodged itself in my mind like a splinter. While Lily finished her homework upstairs, I set the table in silence, watching Mark eat without the easy conversation we once shared. He seemed distracted, scrolling through his phone when he thought I wasn't looking, his thumb moving quickly, as if answering someone who couldn't wait. The following week, the excuses multiplied. There were last-minute client dinners, emergency calls that forced him to step outside, and new habits I couldn't quite explain. Mark had never cared much about his appearance, yet suddenly he was more attentive, pressing shirts with care and fussing over which tie matched his suit. I wanted to believe it was harmless, maybe a surge of pride in his career, but a quiet unease settled into me every time I caught the faint smile tugging at his lips when he read a message he didn't share. Then came Tessa. She was woven into our lives deeply enough that I never questioned her presence, not until she began to appear in places that made less sense. She called Mark more often sometimes about charity events or vendor delays, but her calls stretched into late evenings when business hours had long ended. At school fundraisers, she leaned too easily into his arm when posing for photos, laughing with a warmth that felt rehearsed. I told myself she was simply her usual vibrant self, but each moment began to stitch into a pattern I couldn't ignore. One night, while folding laundry in our bedroom, I heard the low murmur of Mark's voice from the garage. The door was cracked open, and his tone carried the soft cadence he used only when speaking to someone he cherished. I froze, a shirt clutched in my hands, straining to make out the words. I couldn't catch the sentences, but I heard his laugh, low, warm, intimate. When he came back inside, he acted as if he had simply been checking on the car. His phone buzzed in his pocket, and he silenced it before placing it on the nightstand screen, hidden again. The unease followed me everywhere. I noticed the subtle change in his temper, the way small disagreements now ended with his sighs or dismissive gestures. Even Lily picked up on it, asking one evening why Dad seemed so tired all the time. I brushed her question aside, unwilling to let her shoulder the doubts I carried. But when she mentioned that she had seen Dad and Aunt Tessa together at the coffee shop near school one afternoon, leaning close over a table, my chest tightened. I asked her not to worry, though. Inside, I felt the first stirrings of dread solidify into something undeniable. Mark's father, Walter, came over for dinner that weekend. He had always been sharp-eyed, a man who valued honesty and hard work above charm. As we cleared the dishes, he pulled me aside, gently lowering his voice. "Elena," he said, "I don't know what's going on with Mark, but he's been distant. Don't let him fool you into thinking you're imagining it." His words cut through the fog of doubt I had been clinging to, affirming what I already feared. Walter's concern wasn't casual. It was the recognition of a father who had seen changes in his son that couldn't be explained away by work. Still, I kept my silence. Nights stretched longer, filled with the glow of his phone screen, and the excuse of deadlines that didn't exist. Sometimes, as I lay in bed pretending to sleep, I heard the faint clicking of keys as he texted in the dark, a soft chuckle slipping past his lips. When I asked him once what was so funny, he snapped that it was nothing, turning his back toward me, until the silence grew heavy. The breaking point, though, subtle, came on a rainy Tuesday. I had left school early after a meeting was canceled and decided to stop by the downtown hotel where Mark had mentioned a client luncheon. I thought perhaps I could surprise him, share an umbrella, and remind ourselves of the small gestures that once defined us. But when I walked into the lobby, I didn't see him among colleagues. I saw him at the bar leaning close to Tessa, his hand brushing hers, as if it had every right to linger there. I froze, rooted to the spot, as my heart pounded in my chest. They didn't see me. They were too absorbed in each other, heads bent together in a way that was unmistakable. I backed away quietly, slipping out into the rain with my breath caught in my throat. My umbrella hung useless at my side as I walked to the car, each step heavier than the last. The doubts were gone now, replaced by a clarity that chilled me more than the weather ever could. At home, I sat in the darkened living room until Mark returned late, dripping from the rain. He smiled at me absently, shaking off his coat as though nothing had happened. When I asked how the luncheon went, he said it had been productive, his eyes avoiding mine. I nodded, my lips pressed together, hiding what I had seen. In that moment, I chose silence, not out of weakness, but because I needed time. Time to absorb the truth. Time to decide what came next. The house was quiet as Lily slept upstairs, unaware of the storm beginning to unfold around her. I looked at Mark sitting across from me, his features so familiar, and wondered how long he had been living two lives under the same roof. I felt the first real fracture in the trust that had bound us, a crack that could never be patched with excuses. And as the clock ticked on, I knew the shadows I had tried to ignore were no longer at the edges. They were here in my home, seated right across from me. The silence in our house grew heavier after that rainy Tuesday, though Mark pretended nothing had changed. He still came home late, his excuses polished and casual, but I heard the hesitation in his voice when he answered my questions. He moved through the kitchen as if he were a guest instead of a husband, never quite meeting my eyes, always quick to hide his phone or step outside when it rang. Each night, I waited for him to slip for some careless word to confirm what I already knew. But he was careful, too careful, and that made the loneliness inside me even sharper. I learned how to wear my pain quietly. At school, I smiled for students and colleagues listening to their troubles with the patience expected of me, though my own heart felt like glass held together by threads. At home, I kept dinner on the table and the laundry folded routines that gave me something to cling to when everything else seemed uncertain. Even Lily noticed the distance. One evening, she asked if Dad was mad at us. Her voice tentative, her eyes filled with worry I wanted to erase. I told her he was just busy, that work was demanding more than usual, though the lie left a bitter taste in my mouth. Nights were the hardest. I would lie awake beside Mark, his back turned, the faint glow of his phone slipping through the dark as he typed messages I wasn't allowed to see. Sometimes I closed my eyes and pretended to sleep, listening to the quiet rhythm of his laughter when he thought I couldn't hear. Other times, I stared at the ceiling, feeling the weight of every unspoken word pressing down on me. I began to dread the sound of his footsteps in the hallway, the casual way he would brush past me without really seeing me. It was as though I had become a shadow in my own marriage. There were moments when anger rose in me, sharp and demanding, urging me to confront him, to demand answers he couldn't deny. But each time, fear pressed it back down. I was afraid of what speaking the truth would unleash, afraid of breaking apart the family I had worked so hard to keep whole. I thought of Lily, her laughter drifting down the hallway, her future so close to unfolding, and I told myself she deserved stability, even if it meant I carried the silence alone. My tears came in secret, hidden in the shower, where the water could drown them out, or in the car when no one was watching. The smallest things began to hurt the most. The empty chair at dinner when Mark claimed to be working late. The way Tessa's name flashed across his phone when he thought I wasn't looking. The memory of years spent building a life together, now fading beneath the weight of his secrets. I tried to cling to the good, to remember the man who once brought me flowers on a random Tuesday, who laughed with Lily in the backyard until their sides ached. But those memories felt distant now, replaced by a stranger who shared my roof, yet kept his heart elsewhere. One Saturday, I found myself standing in front of our bedroom mirror, studying the tired lines beneath my eyes, the way my shoulders slumped with a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying. I thought about the promises we had made, the vows spoken years ago, and I wondered when exactly they had begun to unravel. I felt small in that moment, diminished not just by Mark's betrayal, but by my own silence, by the way I had allowed myself to disappear into the background of my own life. Walter stopped by again that weekend, bringing Lily a book she had mentioned weeks before. After she bounded upstairs to read, he lingered at the kitchen table with me. His voice was low, steady, the kind that carried more weight for its calmness. "Elena," he said, "I know my son. I know when he's hiding something. Don't let him make you carry this alone." I nodded, unable to find the words, my throat too tight to answer. His kindness only deepened the ache, reminding me of the family I was trying so desperately to hold together, while it slipped further from my grasp. I carried that ache into the following days, moving through life with the precision of someone afraid to stumble. I made lunches, signed permission slips, answered calls at work, and smiled when expected, but inside, I was unraveling thread by thread. Each lie Mark told, each late-night call chipped away at the woman I had once been leaving behind, someone I barely recognized. Yet still, I remained silent, clinging to a fragile hope that something might change, that he might remember who we once were, and choose us again. But hope felt heavier with each passing day, and I began to see it for what it was. Another form of denial, another way to delay the truth. I already knew. In the quiet hours when the house was still, and even the clock seemed to hesitate, I felt the weight of that truth pressing down until I could barely breathe. I realized I wasn't just afraid of losing Mark. I was afraid of losing myself entirely in the silence I carried. That fear stayed with me, growing louder each day, until I knew I couldn't ignore it forever. Something inside me whispered that the cracks were widening, that soon the silence would no longer protect me or Lily. It would only consume us. And as I stood one evening in the doorway of our bedroom, watching Mark laugh softly at his glowing screen, I understood that the time was coming when I could no longer pretend. The truth would demand to be faced, and when it did, nothing in our lives would ever be the same again. The night I finally admitted the truth to myself, I was standing at the kitchen sink with my hands in the soapy water. Mark had gone upstairs to shower, and his phone buzzed against the counter. For months, I had trained myself not to look, not to cross that line, but something inside me shifted. My hands were still wet when I reached for it, drying my fingers quickly on a dish towel before the screen went dark. What I saw was small, a message preview from Tessa that read, "Can't stop thinking about last night." That single line stripped away the last shred of denial I had clung to. I didn't open the phone. I didn't need to. The words were clear enough, and the truth settled into me with an almost eerie calm. I stood there in the quiet kitchen, listening to the sound of the shower upstairs, and realized the life I had believed in no longer existed. It wasn't suspicion anymore. It wasn't doubt. It was reality, and it left me steadier than I expected. When Mark came downstairs in his robe, humming lightly, as if nothing in the world was wrong, I couldn't bring myself to say a word. He poured himself a glass of water, glanced at me, and offered a quick smile. I returned it with one of my own, though inside, I felt a sharpness growing, not wild anger, but something far colder. For the first time, I wasn't just hurt. I was awake. The days that followed were marked by a strange clarity. At work, I listened to students' worries with a focus I hadn't felt in weeks, as though my mind had separated itself from the chaos at home. At night, I studied Mark with new eyes. I noticed how quickly he brushed off Lily's questions about his schedule, how his laughter at the dinner table seemed thinner, more practiced. I saw the way his attention drifted when I spoke, and how often his hand lingered over his phone. It wasn't hidden anymore. It was simply unspoken, and I understood the rules of the new reality I was living in. One evening, I sat with Lily in the living room while she worked on her college essays. She looked up from her laptop, her brow furrowed. "Mom," she asked softly, "are you and Dad okay?" My throat tightened, but I forced my voice steady. "We're fine, sweetheart. Just a lot going on." She studied me for a moment, as if weighing whether to believe me, then nodded slowly and went back to typing. I watched her from across the couch, the light from the lamp catching in her hair, and I knew I couldn't let this fester into something that scarred her view of love and family. The weight of silence was no longer a shield. It was a burden, and I could feel it crushing me. So I began to plan quietly in the solitude of early mornings and late nights. I started with the practical things, checking our joint accounts, reviewing the household bills, reminding myself of what was in my name and what wasn't. I wasn't preparing for an explosion. I was preparing for survival for the day when Mark's lies no longer stayed in the shadows. Walter stopped by one afternoon to drop off a set of tools he thought Mark might need for the garage. Mark wasn't home, so Walter lingered at the table with me. He studied my face for a long moment before speaking. "Elena, I don't know the details, but I can see the strain on you. You don't deserve to carry this by yourself." His words were gentle, but they struck deep. I nodded, swallowing hard, and placed my hand over his. "Thank you, Walter," I whispered. I couldn't bring myself to explain more, but I think he already knew. The nights grew heavier, and the small signs piled higher. A forgotten receipt in his jacket pocket for a dinner I hadn't shared. The faint trace of perfume in his car when I borrowed it to run an errand. The way Tessa's name slipped too easily into casual conversation, as though saying it often enough would normalize her presence in his life. Each detail cut, but they also sharpened me. The sorrow that once drowned me began to transform into something stronger, a resolve that hummed quietly beneath my grief. I didn't confront him. Not yet. Instead, I let him believe his secrets were still safe, that I was still the wife, willing to pretend she didn't see the cracks forming. At night, as he texted in the dark, I lay beside him with my eyes closed, my mind no longer clouded by doubt. I knew what I was facing, and I knew I couldn't go back. The only way forward was through, and I would not walk it blindly anymore. One night, after Mark drifted into sleep, I slipped quietly out of bed and sat at the dining room table. The house was silent, the only sound the steady hum of the refrigerator. I pulled a notepad toward me and began to write not a plan exactly, but a record, a grounding of all I had seen and all I now understood. Each word steadied me, each line pulling me further from despair and closer to clarity. By the time the clock struck midnight, I set the pen down and leaned back in the chair. My chest still ached, but the weight was shifting. I was no longer clinging to the hope of saving what we had. I was preparing myself for the storm that was coming. And deep down, I knew the storm would break sooner than I was ready for. The slip came on a Friday night when Mark arrived home later than usual and dropped his jacket carelessly across the back of a chair. His phone buzzed as he washed his hands in the kitchen sink, and for once, he didn't rush to silence it. The screen lit with a preview long enough for me to read, "Can't wait to see you tomorrow." There was no name attached, but I didn't need one. I folded the towel in my hands and set it on the counter, forcing my voice calm, when I asked if he would be busy over the weekend. He nodded quickly, saying something about a client breakfast. His tone too polished, his eyes never quite meeting mine. I went to bed early that night, but not to sleep. While Mark settled into his side, already drifting off, I stared at the ceiling, with my mind moving faster than my heartbeat. The quiet grief I had carried for weeks began to take a different shape, sharper, steadier. I no longer felt like the woman trapped in silence. I felt like the woman who had once built a career from the ground up, who knew how to stay composed while planning 3 steps ahead. It wasn't rage that steadied me, it was the certainty that I had to take back control. The next morning, I woke before sunrise and brewed coffee while the house still slept. At the table, I opened my laptop and began organizing what I knew. Bank statements, mortgage details, Lily's college savings, all neatly cataloged in folders I had ignored for too long. My hands trembled at first, but with each click, the fear receded. Numbers didn't lie. Accounts revealed patterns, and in those patterns, I began to see exactly where Mark had pulled away from our family and redirected his energy. By the time he came downstairs in his pressed shirt and polished shoes, I had already copied the documents onto a flash drive. He kissed my cheek distractedly before heading out, mumbling something about meetings downtown. I watched him leave with the faintest smile tugging at my lips. Not a smile of happiness, but of resolve. His absence no longer felt like abandonment. It felt like opportunity. That weekend, I called my sister-in-law Diane, who had always been frank in her opinions but kind in her delivery. Over coffee at a quiet cafe, I shared enough for her to understand without laying every wound bare. She listened carefully, her hand covering mine on the table. "Elena," she said softly, "you've given him everything. Your trust, your loyalty, your years. Don't give him your silence too." Her words settled into me like stone, anchoring what I had already begun to feel. I didn't tell her the full extent of my plan, but I knew I wouldn't face this alone. At home, I became more deliberate. I watched Mark closely, noting where he kept receipts, which accounts he checked most often, and how quickly he brushed aside household questions. I stopped pressing him for explanations, stopped trying to mend conversations he had already broken. Instead, I gave him the appearance of normalcy, all the while storing away details like pieces of a puzzle I would soon assemble. I wasn't rushing toward confrontation. I was preparing patiently, quietly, in the way I had learned years ago, when success depended on discipline rather than impulse. One evening, after Lily had gone to bed, Walter stopped by unexpectedly with a small toolbox he thought Mark might need. Mark wasn't home, so Walter lingered at the kitchen table sipping the coffee I poured. He studied me for a long time before speaking. "You remind me of your mother," he said finally. She had a way of staying calm when storms rolled in. But calm doesn't mean blind. I met his eyes, feeling tears rise, and nodded. I couldn't bring myself to explain everything, but his quiet support gave me strength. I began keeping a journal, not of emotions, but of evidence. Every unexplained absence, every receipt that didn't match his story, every late-night call. It wasn't just for me, it was for the day when the truth would no longer be avoidable. Writing it down gave me clarity, and with clarity came a strange kind of peace. I wasn't waiting helplessly anymore. I was gathering step by step what I needed. Still, there were moments that pierced me. Like when Lily asked if her father would be at her choir performance, her voice filled with hope I couldn't guarantee. or when Mark returned home smelling faintly of a perfume I knew wasn't mine, setting his phone face down, as though the gesture itself could erase suspicion. Each moment cut, but instead of crumbling, I tucked the pain deeper into the resolve forming inside me. The turning point came one afternoon when I walked past the guest bedroom we rarely used. On the desk was Mark's briefcase, slightly ajar with papers peeking out. I paused, my breath caught before slowly pulling it open. Inside were folders, expense reports, hotel invoices, receipts for dinners that had never included me. I copied them quickly, my hands steadier than I expected before placing everything back exactly as I had found it. When I closed the door behind me, I realized I no longer felt like a victim of his choices. I felt like the keeper of his secrets, and soon I would decide when and how they came to light. That evening, as Mark sat across from me at dinner, chatting casually about a long day at the office, I watched him with new eyes. His words slid over the surface of a life he thought I still believed in, but beneath the table, my foot tapped lightly, almost rhythmically. Not from nerves, but from patience. He didn't realize it yet, but I had already begun my quiet defiance. The silence between us was no longer suffocating. It was strategy. And in that silence, I knew the day was coming when the lies he carried so easily would be exposed not by accident, but by my deliberate hand. The night everything tipped began at Walter's house. He had invited us over for dinner, a small gathering meant to celebrate Lily's acceptance into a summer program she had worked hard to earn. Mark arrived late, claiming traffic, and carried with him the same restless energy that had shadowed him for months. I watched him carefully as we sat at Walter's old oak table, his eyes darting often toward the phone he kept half hidden in his lap. Lily beamed as Walter praised her achievements, and for a brief moment I saw the warmth return to her face, but Mark's distracted nods felt like another crack across the surface. When dessert was served, Walter excused himself to fetch an old photograph from the den, leaving me alone with Mark. His phone buzzed again, and this time I caught the screen as it lit up. The message preview was short, but damning. "I'll see you after he leaves." My breath caught, but I steadied myself quickly, leaning back in my chair. Mark must have sensed my gaze because he flipped the phone over with a sharp motion and cleared his throat. "Just a work thing," he muttered. I nodded, my lips pressed into a calm line while inside a quiet fire began to burn. That moment broke something in me, not with rage, but with clarity. I no longer questioned. I no longer doubted. I knew, and knowledge is its own kind of power. The silence I had carried for so long shifted into resolve. By the time we drove home, I had already decided the next step. My voice was steady as I asked Lily to head upstairs when we arrived, giving Mark and me a chance to speak. She kissed my cheek and obeyed without hesitation, leaving us in the dim glow of the living room lamp. I turned to him, my hands folded in my lap. "Mark," I said softly, "how long are you going to keep pretending?" His eyes flickered, his expression tight, and for the first time, he looked directly at me. "I don't know what you mean." His words were clipped defensive, but the hesitation betrayed him. I didn't shout. I didn't accuse. I simply held his gaze. "You do know," I whispered. "You've been lying to me, to Lily, and to your father. And I've given you every chance to stop." For a moment, silence stretched between us, heavy and unyielding. Then his shoulders dropped, and he exhaled, almost as if relieved to no longer keep the mask in place. "Things just changed, Elena," he said. "I didn't plan for it, but Tessa and I—" He stopped, realizing too late that the name had slipped from his mouth. The final thread of pretense was gone. I rose slowly from the couch, my voice low but firm. "I know. I've known for a long time. But this—" I gestured around the room to the house we had built, the life we had shared. "This ends on my terms, not yours." He looked at me then, with something between fear and defiance, but I didn't waver. That night, I slept in the guest room, my door locked, my journal tucked beneath my pillow like a shield. For the first time in months, I felt steady. The storm had broken, but I wasn't swept away. I was standing firm, and Mark didn't yet realize that every lie he had told had already armed me with what I needed. The days that followed were marked by a different rhythm. Mark tried half-heartedly to smooth the edges cooking breakfast one morning, complimenting Lily's work another, but the cracks were too deep. His apologies felt shallow, spoken more from habit than conviction. Meanwhile, I moved carefully, preparing each step with patience. I updated the records I had gathered, filed receipts in a safe place, and began quiet conversations with people who could guide me when the time came. One afternoon, I drove across town to meet a colleague of mine, Patricia Hayes, a woman who had once handled her own divorce with quiet dignity. I didn't share every detail, but I asked for advice for names of lawyers who worked discreetly. She slid a card across the table, her eyes filled with understanding. "When you're ready," she said, "make sure you walk in with everything organized. Knowledge is your armor." I tucked the card into my purse, knowing I wasn't ready yet, but that the moment was drawing closer. At home, I allowed Mark to believe he still had the upper hand. I didn't confront him again, didn't question his late nights, or the sudden business trips that left him unreachable. Instead, I listened, observed, and waited. Each time he grew careless, each time he left behind a receipt or a message, I gathered it quietly. My silence was no longer weakness. It was strategy, and the calmness in my demeanor unsettled him more than anger ever could. One evening, as he left for what he claimed was a late meeting, Lily sat beside me on the couch, her eyes searching mine. "Mom?" she asked, her voice soft. "Are we going to be okay?" I pulled her close, smoothing her hair as I whispered, "Yes, sweetheart. We're going to be okay. I promise." I meant it not because Mark would make it so, but because I would. Later that night, I stood alone in the kitchen, the same place where months earlier I had first seen Tessa's message light up Mark's phone. The air felt different now, no longer suffocating, but clear. I opened my journal and added the final note of the evening: the breaking point has passed. What comes next is mine to decide. And as I closed the cover, I knew the time for silence was ending. Soon, the truth would step into the light, and when it did, I would not flinch. The night of exposure unfolded at the Whitmore Hotel ballroom, where Mark's company was hosting a celebration for closing a record quarter. He insisted I attend, though his invitation was delivered with a strained smile and a tone that suggested obligation rather than desire. I accepted without hesitation, knowing this was the moment I had been quietly preparing for. The ballroom glowed with chandeliers and polished silver, a place where appearances mattered most. And Mark thrived on appearances. He walked beside me in his tailored suit, but the distance between us felt wider than the marble floor beneath our feet. The first slip came quickly. Tessa was there, radiant in a crimson dress that drew more eyes than she realized. She moved toward us with too much familiarity, her hand grazing Mark's arm, as she congratulated him on the company's success. I felt the shift in the room immediately. People noticed. Whispers carried softly under the music, the kind of murmurs that cling longer than the applause for any speech. Mark forced a laugh, pulling his arm back too late, while I stood calmly at his side, my face serene. As the evening went on, I waited. I allowed them both the rope they needed, and they used it without hesitation. During the dinner service, I watched as Tessa leaned in, too close, her voice low, but her laughter bright enough to carry across the table. Mark responded with a smile that held none of the restraint of a married man. Around us, Colleagues exchanged glances, their expressions shifting from curiosity to judgment. It was no longer a secret confined to my journal or hidden text messages. It was a performance played out before an audience that would not forget. When the speeches began, Mark was called to the stage to receive recognition for his leadership. He adjusted his tie, his face a mask of pride as he walked under the lights. I stayed seated, my hands folded in my lap, watching him carefully. His words were smooth, practiced, full of gratitude for his team and promises of continued growth. But as he spoke, I rose quietly from my chair and stepped toward the side of the stage. My movements were calm, deliberate, each step carrying the weight of months of silence. When the applause ended, I asked for the microphone. The MC hesitated, but handed it to me, perhaps sensing something in my steady gaze. My voice was even as I thanked the company for welcoming me as the wife of a man they trusted to represent them. Then I paused, my eyes scanning the room before settling on Mark. Trust, I said, is built not only in business, but in the home. And when it is broken, the damage cannot be hidden. A hush fell over the room. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse with anger. I simply revealed what had been concealed piece by piece, in words as sharp as glass, but delivered with the calmness of truth. I spoke of late nights explained as meetings of receipts that told a different story of messages that carried more than professional interest. And finally, I let my eyes rest on Tessa, her face pale beneath the ballroom lights. Some betrayals happen quietly, I said, but others choose their stage. The silence that followed was heavier than any applause. Mark's face drained of color, his hands tightening at his sides. Tessa shifted uncomfortably, her earlier confidence stripped away in an instant. Around us, whispers swelled into a current that neither of them could escape. Walter, seated near the front, lowered his head with a sorrow that spoke louder than any words. Lily, spared from this gathering, was at home, safe shielded from the ugliness that unfolded in public view. I handed the microphone back and walked calmly to the exit, my heels steady against the polished floor. Behind me, the room buzzed with voices, questions, and judgment, all directed at the two people who had believed their secret could remain hidden. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. Their downfall was no longer mine to orchestrate. It had already begun, and it was complete in the eyes of everyone who mattered to them. At home, later that night, I sat in the quiet of the living room, the lamp casting a soft glow across the room. The house felt different, not yet healed, but lighter somehow, as though the truth had opened the windows after months of suffocating air. I poured myself a glass of water, my hands steady, my heart calm. The silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was clean, expectant, the kind that comes just before something new begins. I knew the days ahead would not be easy. Mark would fight, Tessa would deflect, and there would be questions from those who hadn't witnessed the truth for themselves. But the foundation of their lies had crumbled in the most public way possible. Whatever battles remained, the tide had turned. And as I sat there, listening to the steady tick of the clock on the mantel, I understood that justice had already taken its first full breath. The collapse was no longer a matter of if, but when. When the dust settled after that night at the Whitmore, I found myself walking through days that felt strangely quiet. The storm had passed, and though pieces of it still lingered, the force that had threatened to undo me was gone. Mark's reputation faltered quickly, first in whispers, and then in open conversations, and the confidence that had once carried him into every room drained away. Tessa, who had seemed so bold under the chandeliers, retreated from the spotlight with her charm stripped bare. For both of them, the unraveling was swift. Walter came by often in those weeks, not to offer advice, but simply to sit across the table with a cup of coffee and let me know I wasn't alone. His presence was a steadying one, a reminder that even when people disappoint you, family can still offer shelter. Lily carried herself with remarkable grace, though I could see the sadness in her eyes. She had learned too young that love does not always mean loyalty, but she also saw her mother refuse to break, and I knew that lesson mattered. I spent time clearing the house of shadows. I gathered the receipts, the journals, the reminders of late nights and careful watching, and tucked them into a box that I carried out to the garage. I didn't need them anymore. The truth was out in the open, and its weight no longer belonged to me. What remained inside the house was lighter laughter from Lily's friends, filling the living room quiet evenings with a book in hand, the warmth of knowing that peace had returned. Mark and I spoke little after the confrontation. When we did, the words were careful, trimmed of the old comfort, but free of pretense. He asked for forgiveness, once his voice low, but I didn't answer with promises I couldn't keep. Instead, I told him the truth that forgiveness was not the same as forgetting, and some things once broken cannot be made whole again. It was not anger that shaped my words, but clarity. In time, I chose to move forward rather than look back. I poured my energy into the students who came to me with their own troubles, seeing them with new eyes, knowing that resilience can be taught, not just through lessons, but through example. I tended to Lily's future, helping her prepare for what lay ahead, assuring her that our family's strength would carry her even as one chapter closed. And slowly, I began to feel myself again, not the woman overshadowed by suspicion, but the woman who knew her worth. Justice, I learned, does not always roar into a room. Sometimes it comes quietly through steady choices and calm patience until the weight of lies collapses under its own strain. I did not need revenge to find peace. I needed only to step back to let truth speak for itself and to choose my dignity over despair. As I sit here now with the house quiet and the evening light spilling through the windows, I carry no bitterness. What happened will always be part of my story, but it does not define me. What defines me is that I endured, that I protected what mattered, and that I walked away with my head held high. Before we close, I'd love to know what part of this journey stayed with you most. Share your thoughts in the comments, and if you'd like to hear more true family stories, stay connected here.